don't forget the consumer or customer if it's B2B. When you're thinking about their price, how is the customer or consumer going to react when you take this particular action?
Coffee's for closers only.
So we've established my proposal is sound in principle. Now we're just haggling over price.
Let's see how much we're going for on eBay.
Man, it's the same as Dunkin' Donuts. Costs 15 times the price.
Welcome to Impact Pricing, the podcast where we discuss pricing, value, and the strong relationship between them. I'm Mark Stiving, and I run boot camps to help companies get paid more. Our guest today is Russ Winer. Here are 3 things you want to know about Russ before we start. He is the William H. Joyce Professor of Marketing at NYU. Okay, that sounded formal and official. Probably the most important thing about Russ in my life is he was my dissertation advisor at UC Berkeley and the co-author of my first published paper. Russ just retired, and I was invited to speak at his retirement. And instead of a party, they actually threw a conference. There were incredible luminaries from marketing academics, so Don Layman, John Lynch, Rick Stalen, so many more people that if you were in marketing academics, you would know them. So I actually didn't realize Russ was a superstar. So welcome, Russ.
Thanks, Mark. I don't know if superstar is the right way to characterize me, but I'll take it.
Okay. Well, I want you to brag one more minute, and then we'll jump into something interesting and thoughtful. So besides being my doctoral advisor, what's the one accolade in your career that you're most proud of? Because I didn't list the 100 of them there are.
That's a hard question. I think in terms of awards, I think probably the most prominent is I was named a legend of marketing by the American Marketing Association a few years ago. So that's pretty strong, I think. So I'm pretty proud of that.
That is very strong, very strong. So, hey, so real quick question. How did you get into pricing?
Well, actually, my doctoral dissertation was on advertising, and I've always been interested in advertising as well, probably about as much as pricing. And my early research was on advertising effectiveness using field experiments, which are, of course, big today. And while I was a doctoral student at Carnegie Mellon, there was a very famous economist there named Bob Lucas, who eventually won a Nobel Prize for something called rational expectations. And it had to do with the fact that consumers form expectations of prices, and traditional macroeconomic models did not account for that. And so he and some colleagues basically revolutionized macroeconomics by incorporating consumer price expectations into macroeconomic models. And so I gave a presentation. I read one of his papers. I don't remember. It was a long time ago. And I said, gee, that's probably what consumers are doing when they go to point of purchase. They have some kind of expectations in their head about what they think price is going to be. Then they get to the point of purchase, and mentally they compare the price that they observe to the price that's in their head. And I called that price in their head reference price. And I developed a few papers around that concept. And that's kind of how I got into pricing.
Nice. And so this concept of reference prices actually became a really big deal. A lot of people think about it, talk about it. So you're the inventor of the reference price.
Actually, no. I mean, the concept had been around. What I did, which nobody else had done, was I incorporated the concept of reference price into what we call empirical models, that is using real data from supermarkets, and showed that consumers actually use this reference price when they're making purchases. Prior to that, it had just been a kind of a theoretical concept, but I was the first to actually show that it actually mattered.
Nice. So I spent a lot of my time, especially on podcasts and writing, not quite making fun of behavioral economics, but downplaying behavioral economics quite a bit. Do you think reference prices are behavioral economics? Do they fit in the world of behavioral economics? What's the role there, and how do they relate to each other?
Typically when we talk about behavioral economics today, we're talking about the work of, say, somebody like Dick Thaler, Kahneman, Tversky, people like that, who show that consumers are not necessarily rational when it comes to making decisions, right? So a lot of this work, it's often called behavioral decision making or judgment decision making. That kind of research has been used to show that sort of the economic man or woman that economists have long assumed actually doesn't hold. In fact, people are not that rational. They have all kinds of heuristics, make mistakes in their judgments. And so I don't really feel that that kind of reference pricing is in that vein. It's certainly a behavioral concept. And I like to talk about that word being sort of behavioral pricing, right? When many people talk about pricing, they use economic models of supply and demand or other kinds of ways of modeling price, but they don't often take the consumer side into it, right? How is the consumer reacting to the price that they're seeing or, what they're reading about in the papers in terms of inflation? So, it's not just sort of the firm side that's important when we think about pricing. It's also the consumer side, sort of how are they reacting to the prices that we're putting in the marketplace? So there's definitely a behavioral aspect to it. And I don't know if I would call it behavioral economics, but I certainly call it behavioral pricing.
Okay. And I think the whole reference price piece fits really well when you think about Thaler's beer on the beach story, right? And he talks about acquisition utility versus transaction utility. So it feels to me like reference price is transaction utility.
Yeah, I mean, his beer on the beach experiment showed that people would expect to pay a different price if they were buying it, say, in a store or I don't remember exactly, a bar on the beach, right? They're
Yeah.
something we call context, right? And so people's price expectations would be different depending upon, say, the retail context in which they were buying. So certainly there's a behavioral economics aspect to that. And I was influenced a lot by Thaler's work, although I didn't use it directly, but he has a very famous article in the journal Marketing Science back in the 1980s where he talks about these kinds of utilities. And I would definitely recommend it to any listeners that they take a look at that paper. And I think they'll understand a lot about pricing by reading that paper as well.
Yeah, I thought his acquisition and transaction utility was just really interesting to me. And so I tend, and maybe this is just wrong, but I tend to think of acquisition utility as selling the value of the product. And then I think of transaction utility as all of the other stuff that has nothing to do with selling value. And so I might think of the context that we just talked about. I might think of the last price I paid as a reference price. And in fact, the paper that we did together was on 99 cents. I might think of 99 cents as behavioral in nature, more on the transaction side than on the value or acquisition side.
Actually, now that you mention that 99 cents on pricing stuff, I have a funny short story about that. I have a 10-year-old granddaughter, and she was shopping with my daughter, her mom, of course, and she saw a price in the store. I don't know where they were. I think it was $17.99, something like that. And she asked my daughter, why is there 99 cents after the price? Why do, stores price it like that? And so my daughter passed along this question to me, and I talked to her, sometime after that about why stores use $17.99. And we talked about basically the reason that people often, look at prices and look at a certain digit in the price. So if they charged $18, it would look a lot more expensive than $17.99. I don't know how much of it sunk in, but it's interesting that a 10-year-old consumer would notice that pricing phenomenon in the store.
Yeah, I usually start a lot of my talks off if I'm going to talk about that at all. And I'll just say, look, I remember being 10 years old or 12 years old and going to the grocery and seeing prices that were, 99 cents. And I always wondered, why do companies do that? Do they think we're stupid? Right? We know that's $1. So that was fascinating. And I'm glad your granddaughter found it too.
Yeah, she did. She did.
So before we talk about a topic that I'm going to be really fascinated to just have a conversation with you about, you had said something about wanting to talk about deceptive pricing. What do you mean when you say those words?
Well, deceptive pricing, sadly, has been around for a long time. I think in a bricks and mortar world, when you go to like a discount clothing store, you see often the tags with different prices, with a line, drawn through them, and then sort of a final price there. And of course, deceptive pricing is the idea that, in fact, the store has not really marked down the price to what you see, indicating that they actually charge those prices through which the lines were drawn. And so that final price that you're looking at is, in fact, a deceptive price. Again, it's not based on markdowns to make it look like there's some kind of huge deal going on. And I think what we're seeing a lot today is we're seeing that kind of pricing going on the web. And I was involved with some litigation as an expert recently. I won't talk about the case, but basically that's what happened. A competitor to the client that I was working with had done the same thing. This was more expensive, like hundreds of dollars kind of item, had one price scratched out and then a lower price to make it look like they had reduced the price significantly from the original price, when in fact investigation showed that they had never, ever actually charged that original price. And in fact, the one that you could see was the price, sort of a normal price that they were charging. So, I think that this concept of deceptive pricing, as I said, has been around for a long time, and the FTC has been interested in it for a long time as well. But I think what's interesting is that it's definitely either moving or has moved to the internet as well.
I don't know a lot about advertising and the rules, especially around advertising, but it feels to me like deceptive pricing is the exact same thing as lying in an ad. And so if I was lying about a feature or capability, that would be the same thing as lying that says, hey, this used to be priced at this price.
I would not disagree with that. I think that the difference is that there are watchdogs in advertising. There are a number of different trade associations that kind of, I don't say kind of not limit it, but certainly, take a look at all the advertising that's out there and will point out when something is deceptive. And we don't see that much anymore. There was certainly, a lot of deceptive advertising around in the earlier days of advertising. The most famous example is Campbell's Soup, where they used marbles in the soup when they showed the ad on TV or in a print ad to show the vegetables kind of floating on the top to indicate, wow, there's a lot of vegetables in the soup. When in fact, of course, if you make a bowl of vegetable soup, all the vegetables sink to the bottom. Campbell's had to take that advertising off the air. It's very hard to police. The only people really policing the pricing that's going on is a competitor. And in this case, it was a competitor that was my client that flagged this company that was using the deceptive pricing. There's no, it's pretty much Wild West out there, often in internet advertising, internet marketing. And so, again, it was a competitor that flagged it, sued them, and they changed the pricing policy. So anyway.
Nice. And
it's kind of like deceptive advertising. I agree with that.
Yeah. And it seems obvious that you're brought in because of the fact that deceptive price is essentially trying to set a reference price. We're trying to get people to believe this was the original price.
Exactly. Right. Yeah. So the $99 that is scratched out and now it's, $69, is the reference price. People are saying, wow, they dropped the price $30, when in fact it never was priced at $99 and the company is just being deceptive on the reference pricing.
Nice. Russ, I want to change topics and talk about something that I didn't even think about this until I went back to your retirement conference. And I got to see the difference between academics and practice. And it was extremely blatant. I haven't been or even thought about academics for 20 years. And going to that conference again was so insightful and eye-opening to me. And so let me just toss that wide open softball to you. What do you see as the difference or the relationship between academics and practice when we start thinking about marketing?
Well, I think that what academics do is we try to develop a general theory, right? When you're hired to be a consultant, say for a company, which like you do, you're brought in to solve a particular problem that company has. What academics do is we try to develop a more general framework that is not context specific. it might be somewhat context specific. For example, it might be for, say, a durable good versus a, frequently purchased product, say you find in a supermarket. But otherwise, it tends to be fairly context independent. And so the theory tends to be somewhat general. And so if you find or develop a model and you develop some hypotheses like, if the price that you observe is higher than the reference price, the one that's in your mind, that's going to negatively affect the probability of you buying. So that would be a general hypothesis. And then what we do is we collect some data, not every product category, and we empirically test that to a point that we're fairly satisfied that that hypothesis is supported. And in the case of reference pricing, even though my original paper only had 2 product categories in it, it's been replicated so many times that, in fact, it is now, I'm going to call it truth. Okay. It's something that exists. So I think, to answer your question, Mark, I think the difference between academia and practice is that, we think from a more general perspective. We might start out from a specific perspective, a specific product or brand, but we try to develop more general theories that could be applicable in different situations. And, in fact, there's an old saying, right? There's nothing as practical as a good theory. And I think academics truly believe that in fact, if you have a good theory and it turns out to be supported by data, then you do have something to say to practitioners. Some of it is just that we enjoy doing what we do and, don't want to work for a company, right? So we prefer thinking, at our desks than working for a boss. So some of it's more, lifestyle and individual kind of things that academics are interested in. But I think that academics are actually interested in practice. It's just we hit it from a different angle.
Yes. So before I take it to the next step, comment on B2C versus B2B for a second. I live in the B2B world, but almost all of the research I was watching at the conference is in the B2C world. Do you have a thought on that?
Well, I think B2C has been definitely more popular just because of data availability. I mean, there's so much like scanner data and now, social media data that are available for frequently purchased products and consumer products that I think people are necessarily drawn to that. I think, certainly social media data available for B2B as well, but, it's just not as voluminous and it's much harder to collect B2B data. There's not as many kind of standard data collections. There's not like a Nielsen that collects scanner data at point of purchase. You have to dig a lot harder. And I think that that's probably the reason there's been more research in B2C than B2B. But, clearly B2B, I think in aggregate, I think there's a bigger aggregate dollar number in terms of business than B2C. So I think it's sort of data availability, as my guess, has been the main driver behind the attractiveness of B2C research.
I think that makes a lot of sense. Data availability is probably one of the big drivers. Also, it makes sense to me that in the world of B2C, you typically have a single decision maker, and so it's easier to test that. And in B2B, we often sell to committees of people, and you don't know which department is going to buy it. And
that's right, except in the case of expensive durable goods like automobiles or real estate, where, maybe a couple people would be involved. B2C tends to be individuals choosing their favorite soft drink, right, in a store or, food and drug place. So, yeah, I think that's certainly the case.
Yeah. And what's interesting is, so conjoint analysis, of course, we think about that in the world of B2C, but it turns out we use it a lot in B2B world. It depends on who it is that you get to do be the respondents.
Yes. I think there's conjoint is just a data analysis, method. But I agree with you. I think that where in a B2C context, you might run a conjoint on, say, one consumer, you would need to understand the utility function of the buying center or everybody involved, with the purchase in a B2B setting. So it's definitely more complicated.
Yeah. Interesting. So one of the people, and I apologize for not remembering who it was, but one of the people at your conference had talked about how industry was now doing more research or deeper research than academics are. And so when you start thinking of all of the scanner panel data or all of the data that's out there, look at Amazon. Amazon's probably not hiring academics to do research. Amazon's hiring statisticians to do research. What are your thoughts on research moving into industry as opposed to being in academics?
I think that's a great question. And it's one that I've actually thought about for, a number of years, maybe 10 years, given the rise of the Facebooks and Airbnbs and Googles that have all this data. And, I think at one time, academics had a real edge over business. All right. I think, as I said, academics were sort of, working on general problems that I think many companies found useful. I knew that, in fact, companies would hire, maybe consultants who could read our journals and take stuff from us, for free. We're not very good at protecting our IP and using it, and I think that went on for a long time. But as you said, these companies, the internet companies, have been successful, not just internet, big ones, even small ones now have analytics people. They hire PhDs in statistics or sometimes PhDs in marketing. And they've got tremendous assets, intellectual assets in-house now. And my fear was that actually academic marketing was going to become almost obsolete because you had, really top tier academic departments inside these companies that were just had access to all of Facebook data, right? And all of Google data, instead of just sort of what academics do is they kind of what's called scraping it off the web. They run programs that can take, what they can see, what you can see on the web, but it's not, you don't get under the hood the way people working in the companies do. And I think that's still, it's a problem for academics. I think I would have to say more and more, the companies are opening up and giving access to data. Many of these companies use academics as outside consultants, or the academics go for a year and do sort of internal, maybe some consulting. And I think the Chinese companies have really been pretty open about giving data to academics. And you didn't see it that much when you were at my conference, but what we call marketing science, or the people who do quantitative work in marketing, really is heavily populated by people from China. They get their PhDs in Western countries, but they have very good contacts then with companies in China, and they're using that data. So even if Facebook doesn't allow, outside academics to use much of their data, there's still some really interesting work going on because of the, social media companies and e-commerce companies in China that are letting academics use their information. So I think it's a very relevant question that you ask, and I think it's one that's concerned me. And I still think that I still worry about the edge that we have over the companies doing their internal work.
So I think one of the edges that academics have is that they're not biased or trying to achieve a goal. They're just trying to learn truth. But
that's certainly a problem, right? I mean, the companies are hiring their staffs to work on problems of their, that they're concerned about, right? Not general problems, but, how to make search more efficient or how to utilize Facebook data, like data, et cetera, not sort of general issues. Sorry, I cut you off, but
that's okay.
Academics are more interested in more general questions. The problem with academics is that we tend to be slow, right? And I think that's one of the things that's slow in terms of getting the work done. And, the academics have other parts of their jobs, right? We've got teaching classes, we've got administrative work, we do our research, but a company, has some information, they've got a business problem, and they can't wait 6 months to a year, right, for an academic to get to it. So, I can understand sometimes their frustrations with working with people like me.
So the other thing that I found very fascinating at your conference is I always pictured marketing as, how do I help companies make more money? And it certainly felt to me at the conference that marketing is more, how do I protect consumers from big bad companies? What are your thoughts on that?
Maybe you could rephrase that. I'm thinking about. I'm not sure. I quite
Sure.
get the question.
Sure. So let's go back to deceptive pricing for a second. So when we talk about deceptive pricing, what we're really saying is, hey, this is a company that's taking advantage of consumers. So I could go testify in court over the fact that, hey, this is really bad behavior. When you think about reference pricing, I would have flipped that the other way and said, hey, we think about reference prices. And now the question as a company is, how do you influence your customers' reference prices? Because the higher the reference price, the higher the price they're actually willing to pay for your product. Right. And so one is, how do I help companies make more money? The other is, how do I protect consumers from companies?
Well, I guess I don't see, anything the marketer does to push up the reference price as hurting consumers. I think that we live in a world of, I think, extreme competition. I don't think consumers some people might think they're being manipulated to some extent, but there are, for every brand that's trying to do that, there are several other brands that are available, plus, private labels that have become obviously very successful, especially, since the pandemic. And there are other channels, right? Discount channels like Lidl and Aldi, right? The German retailers have become very successful in the US by charging, everyday low prices, having an EDLP, strategy. So I think what saves marketers is they still have to compete in the world of fairly intense competition. And I think we're starting to see that, actually. I think the days of inflation where the packaged goods companies could keep raising price with impunity are pretty much over. And I think that they're starting to think about, well, did we raise them too much? Do we have to offer promotions, maybe price promotions to make the prices look lower? So I think the competitive world limits the concept of consumer manipulation in the way you describe it.
We're definitely seeing prices coming down in the fast food world right now. They're competing on price again all of a sudden. So
yeah, I don't know. What do you see in B2B, which is more your bailiwick?
Yeah, so in the world of B2B, we don't see that much commoditization of product. And so typically once you've won a deal, you get a customer that buys from you over and over and over again. In the subscription world, or at least the reoccurring revenue world, it gives us room to raise prices. But if you go too far, then you lose a customer, and that's a bad thing. But there isn't as much price pressure, and I don't see any price pressure to decrease prices, where I do see that on the consumer side.
Okay. All right.
So
sounds good.
Pretty interesting. Russ, this has been fascinating. I love talking to you. We could talk for forever, but I want to ask the question I always ask. Hopefully it's not a hardball for you. What is one piece of pricing advice you would give our listeners that you think could have a big impact on their business?
I think the one piece of advice is something I mentioned earlier is don't forget the consumer, all right, or customer if it's B2B. When you're thinking about their price, how is the customer or consumer going to react when you take this particular action? So you might say, well, it's cost justified, right? Our supplier is raising its input costs, so we have to pass that along to the consumer. Well, just remember that the consumer has options and the consumer is not responsible for your cost increases and therefore might find a different option. So I think my one message is just keep your eye on, or your thinking on, how is the customer going to react to this pricing decision?
Absolutely. That's a spot on answer. Thank you, Russ. And Russ, thank you for your time today. If anybody wants to contact you, how can they do that?
I think the best way is through email. My email address is RWINER. My last name is spelled just like the beverage. RWINER at Stern, STERN.NYU.edu.
Excellent. And I think you are the first .edu email address we've ever given out on this podcast.
Okay, well, I hope you do more.
We're going to try. So to our listeners, thank you for your time. If you enjoyed this, would you please leave us a rating and a review? And if you have any questions or comments about the podcast, or if your company needs help getting paid what their true value is, feel free to email me, mark@impactpricing.com. Now, go make an impact.